Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey into a world of silk and shadow, a place where power flowed not through the battlefield, but through whispered secrets and gilded corridors. We're heading straight into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a place of unimaginable luxury and brutal razor-sharp politics, a world where one young woman, often remembered as a monster, carved out a place for herself that history would struggle to forget. Her tale is a whirlwind of survival and ambition, a story so intense that even the most hardened characters probably won't survive this journey with us. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Post it in the comments. I love seeing where our little night owl community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Her name, if you can even call it that, began as a sound, a rustle of silk and a gasp of fear on a moonless night. Born somewhere in the rugged plains of what is now Ukraine, she was just a girl, a name whispered in a small village, a life meant for a simple wooden cottage and the smell of fresh-baked bread. She was Roxana, or perhaps Anastasia, a forgotten name lost to the sands of time and the brutality of a Tatar slave raid. One moment she's watching the sunset with a sense of peace, the next, a shadow falls over her, a hand claps over her mouth, and the world goes silent save for the thundering hooves of horses and the cries of her neighbours, who they probably wouldn't survive either. The men who took her were not faceless monsters, but rather a force of nature, a part of the brutal ecosystem of the pre-modern world where borders were fluid and human lives were commodities. She and the other captives were herded like cattle, tied together, their feet blistered and bleeding on the long march south. The sun beat down on them, an indifferent observer to their suffering. They travelled for weeks, through forests and over rivers, their meagre rations barely enough to keep them alive. The journey stripped them of everything they were, their names, their families, their futures. They were no longer individuals. They were a collective of broken spirits, their only hope a distant and terrifying unknown. The destination was Kefi, a bustling port city on the Crimean Peninsula, a major hub for the slave trade, where merchants from all corners of the world haggled over human lives as if they were sacks of grain. The air here was thick with the smells of salt, spices, and unwashed bodies. Here, under the watchful, judging eyes of wealthy traders, she was cleaned, examined, and prepared for sale. Her captors, a rough-and-tumble bunch who smelled of sweat and horses, saw in her something more than just a slave. Her red hair, a fiery cascade that defied the dark tresses of her captors, and her green eyes, bright and defiant despite her terror, marked her as special. She was a curiosity, a prize to be sold for a high price. Her uniqueness, which in her village might have been seen as a sign of beauty or a touch of the fae, now made her a valuable commodity. A merchant named Piali Pasha purchased her. A man of cunning and ambition, he saw in her not just a beautiful slave, but a potential investment. He knew that a girl of such striking beauty and spirit would fetch a high price in the most exclusive market of all, the Sultan's harem. The journey to Istanbul, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, was a different kind of horror. She was no longer a part of a nameless hoard, but a single, valuable item. Piali Pasha treated her with a strange mix of cruelty and care. He fed her well and clothed her in clean, if simple, garments. But he also reminded her constantly of her new reality. Her life was no longer her own. She was a possession, a thing to be presented to the most powerful man in the world. As they sailed across the Black Sea, the city of Istanbul rising on the horizon was not a beacon of hope, but a terrifying and awe-inspiring fortress. The Hagia Sophia's dome, a monumental testament to both Byzantine and Ottoman power, dominated the skyline. The Topkapi Palace, a sprawling labyrinth of courtyards and gilded cages, was her ultimate destination. This was the seat of power, a place of opulence and intrigue, where every whisper could be a death sentence and every smile a lie. Upon arrival, she was taken to the palace and presented to the chief eunuch, a powerful figure who controlled access to the Sultan's private quarters. He examined her with a cold, professional eye, a man whose job was to judge a woman's worth not by her character, but by her physical beauty and potential for pleasing the Sultan. He noted her red hair and green eyes, the fiery combination that made her stand out from the typical dark-haired beauties of the harem. This unusual appearance was both a blessing and a curse. It made her unique and memorable, but it also marked her as an outsider, a foreigner in a world that prized conformity and tradition. He gave her a new name, a tradition in the harem. The old one was erased, a final severing of her ties to her past life. She was now Harem, the cheerful one. The irony of the name, given to a terrified, broken girl, was not lost on her. It was a name meant to reflect the role she was expected to play, a smiling, docile concubine whose only purpose was to entertain and please. The harem was a world unto itself, a gilded cage filled with hundreds of women from all corners of the empire and beyond. There were concubines, slaves, and servants, all living in a strict hierarchy governed by the valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and the powerful network of eunuchs. For Harem, the first days were a blur of new rules, new faces, and a pervasive sense of fear. The other girls, a mix of jealousy and curiosity in their eyes, whispered about her. Her strange hair and foreign looks made her a subject of fascination and suspicion. They spoke of the Sultan, a man of power and charisma, a figure both revered and feared, a man whose gaze could change a woman's life forever. They gossiped about the favourites, the ones who had been chosen, who lived in greater luxury and held more sway. It was a brutal meritocracy, where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to capture the Sultan's attention, and, more importantly, to give him a son. Historians still argue whether Harem was a simple girl from a small village, or if she was a noblewoman of some kind, captured in a twist of fate. The truth is likely lost to time, but her story serves as a reminder that in the vast churning empire, no one was safe from the whims of fate and the brutal realities of the world. She was given a rigorous education. Unlike some of the slaves who were meant for menial labour, she was being prepared for the inner sanctum. She learned Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. She studied poetry, music, and the art of conversation. The goal was to make her not just a beautiful body, but an intelligent companion for the Sultan, a woman who could engage him in more than just physical pleasure. This was a mainstream historical fact, the rigorous education of some concubines, but there was also a darker, more fringe side to her education. There were whispers of old women, wise in the ways of healing and herbs, who taught her how to use plants not just for medicine, but for other, more nefarious purposes. These were the hushed lessons, the secrets passed down from generation to generation in the dark corners of the harem. As she learned, Harem began to understand the power dynamics of the harem. The women here were not just rivals for the Sultan's affection. They were pieces on a chessboard, their every move watched and judged. The valide Sultan, the ultimate authority, loomed over them all, a silent, powerful judge. Hurrem's fiery spirit, once a source of terror and shame, began to harden into a weapon. She realised that her life was no longer a matter of fate, but a matter of choice. She could either remain a terrified, nameless girl, or she could become something more. She chose the latter. The cheeky warning at the beginning, that some people might not survive this journey with us, applies to the characters within the story as well, and Harem, with her innate fire and ambition, was a prime candidate to not just survive, but to thrive. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was a player in a dangerous game, one she was just beginning to learn. The red hair and green eyes, once a symbol of her foreignness, became a banner of her uniqueness, her difference. She would not be another face in the crowd. She would be Harem, the cheerful one, and she would make them all remember her name. The stage was set, the Sultan was waiting, and a new chapter in Ottoman history was about to be written, one silk-clad step at a time. This wasn't just a bedtime story, it was a prelude to a storm. The Sultan's gaze, when it fell upon a woman, was not a casual glance. It was the concentrated force of an empire's will, a heat that could melt a life of quiet anonymity and forge it into something new and terrifying. For Harem, the moment of that gaze was a turning point. It happened not in a grand hall, but in the quiet, controlled chaos of the harem baths. She was there with the other new arrivals, a sea of young women, all being prepared for their daily duties. The air was thick with steam and the scent of jasmine oil, a deceptive aroma that masked the underlying tension. It was a regular part of the routine, a ritual of purification and beautification. They were scrubbed and oiled, their hair braided, their bodies made to be as perfect as humanly possible. It's a quirky historical tidbit that the use of crocodile dung as a cosmetic was popular in some parts of the ancient world. But thankfully, for Harem, the Ottomans had moved on to more fragrant and less alarming beauty regimens. The Sultan, Suleiman, was a figure of immense power and charisma, a man who would become known to history as the Magnificent. He was not a distant figure locked away in the palace's innermost sanctum. He would often make his way through the harem, his presence a silent, overwhelming force. On this particular day, he was taking a quiet stroll, an inspection of his human property. The chief eunuch, a man whose every movement was an act of deference and control, preceded him, a silent herald of his approach. The other concubines, trained to be submissive and quiet, bowed their heads, their hearts thumping a frantic rhythm against their ribs. But Harem, the girl with the fiery red hair, did something different. Whether it was an act of defiance, a moment of reckless courage, or simply a misstep born of her foreign upbringing, she looked at him. Her green eyes, a striking contrast to the sea of brown and black, met his directly. The world, for a brief, breathless moment, seemed to hold its breath. Suleiman paused. He was a man accustomed to seeing downcast eyes and veiled faces. This woman, this new arrival, dared to meet his gaze. It wasn't an act of seduction, not yet. It was a simple, raw display of her spirit, a refusal to be just another anonymous face in the crowd. The Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was also present, a silent, disapproving presence. She watched with cold eyes, a flicker of something close to disdain crossing her face. She was the one who managed the harem, the ultimate authority on who was chosen and who was ignored. She saw in Harem not a potential favourite, but a disruption, a dangerous variable in the carefully managed system. She already had a favourite for her son, a beautiful Circassian woman named Mahidevran, who had already given Suleiman a son, Prince Mustafa. Mahidevran was the epitome of what a sultan's concubine should be: beautiful, docile, and, most importantly, the mother of the heir apparent. But Suleiman was intrigued. He gave a quiet order to the chief eunuch. Harem was to be prepared for his chambers that very night. The news spread through the harem like a spark in dry tinder. The other women, the ones who had mocked her for her red hair and her foreignness, now looked at her with a mix of envy and fear. This was the moment every concubine dreamed of, the one chance to escape a life of servitude and ascend to a position of power. Harem, for her part, was terrified. The training, the lessons, the warnings, they all came rushing back to her in a wave of fear and adrenaline. She was not just being summoned, she was being tested. This was not a social call, it was a life-altering encounter. She was bathed again, this time with greater care and ceremony. Her hair was brushed until it shone like a bonfire. She was dressed in the finest silks, scented with rosewater. She was no longer a slave. She was an object of desire, a potential vessel for the Sultan's legacy. When she entered his chambers, the world was a blur of rich colours and strange, heady scents. The room was not just a bedroom. It was a statement of power, a testament to the wealth of the Ottoman Empire. The walls were covered in intricate tiles, the floors with thick, luxurious carpets. The air was warm, and the only sound was the soft crackle of a fire. Suleiman was there, not in a position of authority, but reclining on a divan, a man relaxing after a long day of ruling an empire. He wasn't a monster, he was a human being, a man with his own worries and desires. He had seen countless women, but Harem was different. There was a fire in her eyes, a passion that was not easily extinguished. She wasn't just beautiful, she was alive. He talked to her, not in the simple, transactional way he spoke to other concubines, but as a person. He asked her about her life before the palace, about her home. She spoke to him not with the rehearsed deference of a concubine, but with the honest, raw emotion of a woman who had lost everything. She spoke of her home, her family, the life she had lost, and she made him laugh. Her wit, her quick tongue, and her passionate way of telling a story captivated him. He was a sultan who ruled a vast empire, but in that moment he was simply a man listening to a woman's story. This was a mainstream historical fact. Suleiman was not just physically attracted to Harem, he was intellectually and emotionally captivated by her. She was a companion, not just a concubine. This was a radical departure from the traditions of the harem, where concubines were meant to be seen and not heard, a beautiful ornament in a life of power. But Suleiman, a man of letters and a lover of poetry, found in her a kindred spirit, a woman who could engage him on an intellectual level. He began to spend more and more time with her, to the growing dismay of the Valide Sultan and Mahidevran, the mother of his heir. The whispers in the harem grew louder. She was a witch, they said, a foreign sorceress who had cast a spell over the Sultan. They whispered about her red hair, a sign of her unnatural powers, and her green eyes, which they claimed could bewitch a man into doing her bidding. Historians still argue whether Harem was truly a sorceress, using folk remedies and rituals to bend the Sultan to her will, or if she was simply a woman who used her wit and charm to win the heart of a powerful man. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. She was a survivor, a pragmatist who understood that in the world of the harem, one had to use every tool at their disposal to survive. The fringe tidbit is that some of her rivals allegedly tried to use black magic against her, burying charms and amulets with her name on them in the palace grounds, a common practice in that era to ward off rivals or cast spells on enemies. It was a world steeped in superstition, where the line between reality and the supernatural was often blurred. The jokes and asides were a way for these women to cope with the stress of their lives, and you can almost hear the nervous giggles in the corners of the harem as they gossiped about the witch with the red hair. The humour was a thin veil for a very real sense of fear and desperation. As Hurrem's influence grew, so did the danger. The Valide Sultan, a woman of immense power and tradition, saw her as a direct threat to the established order. She had a vested interest in seeing Mahidevran's son, Prince Mustafa, ascend to the throne. A new favourite, a foreign girl with no royal blood, was a complication she could not afford. The Valide Sultan began to quietly encourage Mahidevran to assert her position, to remind the Sultan of her place as the mother of his heir. The rivalry was a silent war, fought not with swords and arrows, but with veiled insults, whispered accusations, and carefully timed displays of affection. Hurem was a newcomer, a girl who had nothing but her wit and the Sultan's affection. Mahidevran was a woman of status, the mother of the future Sultan. The odds were stacked against Hurem. The Sultan, a man with the fate of millions in his hands, was not oblivious to the tensions. He was a complex man, a ruler who could be both a fierce warrior and a gentle poet. He was fascinated by Hurem, but he was also a man of tradition. He knew the importance of his heir, and he respected his mother's authority. The stage was set for a conflict of epic proportions. The Sultan's heart was pulled in two directions, a choice between tradition and a newfound passionate love. The fate of an empire and a young woman hung in the balance. The whispers of the harem were no longer just gossip, they were the sound of a coming storm. The girl who was once a nameless captive was now the centre of a political and emotional earthquake that would shake the foundations of the Ottoman Empire for generations to come. The monster was not yet a monster, but the forces that would forge her into one were already at work. With the Sultan's affections turning increasingly towards Hurem, a rival's rise was inevitable, and it arrived not with a thunderclap but with the chilling whisper of a coming winter. The existing favourite, Mahidevran, was a woman of noble Circassian birth, and she had occupied the coveted position of Bashkadin, or chief consort, for years. She was the mother of Prince Mustafa, the eldest son and the unquestionable heir to the throne. Her position was not just a matter of love, but of dynastic stability. In the rigid hierarchy of the Ottoman court, she was the sun around which the other concubines revolved, and her son was the star that would one day shine over the empire. Hurem, with her fiery hair and her foreign tongue, was an anomaly, an unwelcome meteor crashing into her carefully ordered celestial system. Mahidevran, a woman whose beauty was legendary and whose grace was a honed art, watched this interloper with growing alarm. She had given the Sultan a son, a tangible link to the future. What had this new girl given him? Nothing but laughter and whispered conversations. It was not enough to dismiss Hurem as a passing fancy. The Sultan's visits to Hurem's chambers were becoming more and more frequent. He was not just captivated, he was enchanted. He was a man of immense power, but also a man of deep, if sometimes concealed, emotions. Hurem had found a way to the latter, a path that Mahidevran, for all her beauty and status, had never truly explored. The palace was a giant, breathing organism, and the harem was its heart. Every heartbeat, every change in the rhythm was felt by everyone. The chief eunuchs, the Valide Sultan, the other concubines, they all noticed the shift in the Sultan's favour. Mahidevran, a woman of pride and position, could not simply stand by and watch her world crumble. She began to use her influence, subtle at first, to undermine Harem. She would spread whispers among the other concubines, painting Harem as a conniving outsider, a witch who used strange foreign spells to bewitch the Sultan. The stories grew in the retelling, each one more fanciful than the last. Some said she used potions, others that she had a secret charm, a gift from her Russian homeland. The jokes about her strange fiery hair, which had once been a source of nervous laughter, now took on a darker, more sinister tone. Harem, for her part, was not oblivious to the animosity. She was a survivor, a street-smart girl who had learned to read the currents of power and danger with an almost supernatural instinct. She knew that Mahidevran's position was strong, but she also knew that the Sultan's heart was an unpredictable thing. The mainstream historical fact here is that this rivalry between Harem and Mahidevran was one of the most significant and well-documented conflicts in Ottoman court history. It was more than a simple love triangle. It was a power struggle for the future of the empire. The Sultan had not yet formalized Harem's position, and in the absence of a legal marriage, the mother of the eldest son held a powerful, albeit unofficial, position. The tensions finally boiled over during a routine palace feast. The Valide Sultan, ever the puppet master, had orchestrated the event, placing Harem and Mahidevran in close proximity. It was a test, a deliberate act to see how these two rivals would behave. Mahidevran, her face a mask of serene beauty, made a point of ignoring Harem, treating her as if she were invisible, a mere servant. Harem, who had learned the art of courtly conversation and witty repartee, tried to engage her, to break through the icy wall of her rival's disdain. But Mahidevran, in a cutting public display of power, made a snide remark about Harem's foreign origins, about her unrefined manners, a joke that made some of the other concubines nervously titter. It was a calculated insult, a public humiliation. A quirky or fringe tidbit from historical accounts suggests that Mahidevran's jibe was more specific, referencing a particular folk dance or song from Harem's homeland in a mocking tone. Harem, a girl who had been stripped of her home and her family, felt the sting of the insult deeply. The laughter of the other women was like a physical blow, but Harem was not one to back down. She retorted with a sharp, witty remark about Mahidevran's age, and the fact that the Sultan, in her absence, had turned his affections to a younger, more vibrant flower. The joke, delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, landed with a cold thud. The room went silent. The battle lines were drawn. Mahidevran, her face flushed with rage, was not used to being challenged, especially not by a foreign slave girl. The Valide Sultan, a silent spectator, watched with a cold satisfaction. This was exactly what she had wanted, a clear display of the conflict, a reason to intervene and put Harem back in her place. The confrontation escalated quickly. The next day, a heated argument erupted between the two women in the harem quarters. The other concubines watched, a hushed and terrified audience. Mahidevran, her fury finally boiling over, struck Harem. It wasn't a gentle slap, but a violent blow that left Harem with a bruised and swollen face. This act, a public display of physical violence, was a violation of the strict rules of the harem. It was an act of desperation, a last-ditch attempt to assert her dominance. Harem, a woman who had suffered far greater physical and emotional pain in her life, did not fight back. She simply stood there, a silent testament to Mahidevran's loss of control. When Suleyman heard of the incident, he was furious. He was a sultan who prized order and decorum. The idea of his concubines, the women of his household, resorting to physical violence was an affront to his authority. He summoned both women to his presence. Harem, her face still bruised, stood before him, not with a look of meek submission, but with a quiet dignity. She did not whine or complain. She simply presented the evidence of her rival's rage. Mahidevran, for her part, was unrepentant. She justified her actions, claiming that Harem had been disrespectful, a foreign upstart who had bewitched her lord. She saw no wrongdoing, only a necessary act to restore order. But Suleyman saw things differently. He saw a beloved companion, a woman he had grown to respect and care for, physically abused. He saw a woman of rank and position, Mahidevran, losing her composure in a way that was unbecoming of her status. He sided with Harem. He declared that he would no longer eat with Mahidevran, a profound public humiliation and a clear signal of his displeasure. It was a decisive moment in the history of their rivalry. It was a formal demotion, a public stripping of her status as his favourite. Harem, the former slave girl, was now the undisputed favourite. Mahidevran was relegated to the background, her son still a prince, but her own star now fading. Historians still argue whether Suleiman's reaction was a genuine display of affection for Harem, or if it was a calculated political move to assert his own authority over the Valide Sultan and the traditions of the harem. The truth, like most things, is probably a blend of the two. He loved Harem, yes, but he was also a sultan who had to project an image of absolute, unquestioned authority. He could not allow his household to descend into chaos, and he could not allow his mother or his concubines to dictate his personal life. By choosing Harem over Mahidevran, he was not just choosing a lover, he was choosing his own path, a path that was not dictated by tradition or the expectations of his family. Harem's position was now secured. She was the new Bashkaden. Her private quarters were upgraded, her staff increased. She was no longer just a concubine, she was the most important woman in the Sultan's life. The whispers in the harem did not stop, they simply changed tone. Now, the fear was not of her beauty or her wit, but of her newfound power. The other concubines knew that her star was rising, and they had to align themselves with her, or risk being crushed. She had gone from a nameless slave to a woman who could, with a simple request, change the course of a person's life. The monster was not yet fully formed, but the first act of her transformation was complete. The rivalry had served its purpose. It had tested her, refined her, and ultimately elevated her to a position from which she would launch her true assault on power. And all of it began with a single, defiant look into the eyes of a sultan. With Mahidevran's star waning and Harem's ascendant, the palace became a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were not swords, but secrets, and the most lethal substance was not lead, but poison. The shift in power did not go unnoticed. The network of rivalries and alliances that crisscrossed the harem was a complex web, and Harem's sudden rise had snapped many of the old threads. While the Sultan's favour granted her protection, it also made her a target. Her lack of a strong familial network within the empire, a mainstream historical fact that distinguished her from other consorts, made her particularly vulnerable. She was a self-made woman in a world that valued inherited power, and that made her a threat to everyone who clung to tradition. The Valide Sultan, the ultimate matriarch and puppet master, was not about to let this foreign upstart disrupt the dynasty's careful order. She saw Harem as a dangerous variable, a woman who had broken with the established customs. The Valide Sultan, remember, had her own agenda. She was a woman who had navigated the treacherous waters of the palace for decades, and her primary goal was the stability of the empire, which, in her eyes, meant ensuring her eldest grandson, Prince Mustafa, Mahidevran's son, ascended to the throne. Harem, with her increasing influence and, more importantly, her increasing chance of bearing a son, was a direct threat to that plan. The Valide Sultan's displeasure was a silent but suffocating presence, a constant reminder of the precariousness of Harem's position. The attacks began subtly. There were the hushed whispers about Harem's witchcraft, the kind of talk that, in a world steeped in superstition, could easily turn a population against a ruler's favourite. It was a fringe tidbit that rumours of Harem's use of love potions and other folk magic, supposedly from her homeland, were so pervasive that they found their way into some of the more sensationalist historical accounts of the period. But the whispers were not enough. The Valide Sultan and her allies, Mahidevran's supporters, rival consorts, and even some of the more conservative viziers who saw Harem as a disruptive force, knew they needed a more decisive strike. The first serious attempt on her life was a poisoning attempt, a classic palace intrigue trope, which, to be fair, was a disturbingly common occurrence in the courts of the pre-modern world. The attempt happened during a seemingly innocuous event, a special feast held in Harem's chambers to celebrate the Sultan's return from a military campaign. The food was lavish, the wine flowed freely, and the mood was one of celebration. Harem, accustomed to the opulent life of the palace, was enjoying the festivities, surrounded by her trusted servants and a few hand-picked consorts she was trying to win over. A cup of sherbet, a sweet, fruity drink, was brought to her. The cupbearer, a young, nervous-looking girl she didn't recognise, was unusually shaky. Harem, with her street smarts and her ever-present sense of caution, noticed the girl's trembling hands and the odd, almost metallic smell emanating from the drink. She didn't drink it. Instead, she performed a clever, quiet little theatrical trick, one that probably saved her life. As she was about to raise the cup to her lips, she accidentally spilled a small amount on the marble floor. A quick-thinking servant, loyal to Harem, noticed a strange iridescent sheen on the spilt liquid. Later, a cat, drawn by the sweet smell, lapped at the puddle. Within minutes, the animal was dead, its body twitching in a grotesque parody of life. The palace, which had been a place of quiet celebration, descended into a state of silent panic. The cupbearer was immediately apprehended and, under intense questioning, broke down. She confessed that she'd been paid by one of Mahidevran's senior servants, an old woman who had been fiercely loyal to her former mistress for years. This was a classic, albeit brutal, case of a pawn being used to eliminate a queen. The discovery of the poisoning attempt sent shockwaves through the harem. It was a direct, undeniable act of treachery. The Sultan, a man who, let's remember, was a jurist and a lawmaker in his own right, was enraged. This wasn't just a personal attack on his favourite, it was an attack on his authority. He could tolerate the rivalry and the whispers, but an attempt on the life of a woman who carried his potential children was a line that could not be crossed. He ordered a swift and brutal investigation. The cupbearer was executed. The senior servant who had orchestrated the plot was exiled from the palace, her family stripped of their titles and privileges. And Mahidevran, who had vehemently denied any involvement, was formally placed under house arrest in her own quarters, her allowances cut, her staff reduced, and her access to the Sultan severely restricted. Her son, Prince Mustafa, was not punished, but his mother's disgrace was a dark stain on his reputation, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. This incident, which could have been a tragedy for Harem, became a triumph. It solidified her position and demonstrated to the entire court and the empire that an attack on her was an attack on the Sultan himself. Historians still argue whether Harem was truly the victim of a direct plot by Mahidevran, or if it was a more complex conspiracy orchestrated by a network of rivals with the Valid Sultan's tacit approval. The truth is that Harem's enemies were many, and they were all willing to use any means necessary to get rid of her. The incident was a wake-up call for Harem. She realised that she could no longer rely on the Sultan's affection alone to protect her. She had to build her own power base. She began to forge alliances, not with the powerful viziers and pashas, but with the people who had access to the inner workings of the palace. She befriended the chief eunuchs, the women who managed the harem's finances, and even the doctors and healers. She understood that information was power, and she began to build a network of informants who would tell her everything that was happening in the palace, from the most mundane gossip to the most dangerous plots. It was during this period that Harem, who had been a concubine, a favourite, and a survivor, began to transform into a power broker. The nickname the Monster, once a whispered insult, began to take on a more sinister yet also more respectful tone. She was no longer just the Sultan's toy, she was a player in the great game of thrones. She began to use her influence to promote her allies and to subtly undermine her rivals. The Valide Sultan, who had once been the undisputed queen of the harem, now had a rival who operated with the Sultan's full knowledge and affection. The palace, which had once been a carefully managed system, was now a place of open rivalry, with two powerful women, the Valide Sultan and Harem, vying for control. The jokes in the harem were no longer about Harem's hair, but about her surprising ability to navigate the treacherous political landscape. "She's got more lives than a cat," one might whisper, "and more poison than a snake." This period marked a crucial turning point in Harem's life, and in the history of the Ottoman Empire. The poisoning attempt, meant to eliminate her, had instead forged her into a steelier, more ruthless figure. She had learned a hard lesson, that in the palace there was no room for complacency. One had to be constantly vigilant, constantly plotting, and constantly one step ahead of their enemies. She had survived a direct attempt on her life, and in doing so she had established a reputation for being not just a favourite, but a force to be reckoned with. The Valide Sultan had miscalculated. She had thought that by attacking Harem, she would be able to return to the old order. Instead, she had awakened a true rival, a woman who would not rest until she had secured her own position, and more importantly, the position of her future sons. The stage was now set for the next. more dangerous phase of her life. The poisoning attempt had failed, but it had succeeded in one crucial way. It had drawn a line in the sand. On one side stood Harem, the outsider with the Sultan's heart. On the other stood the valide Sultan, the powerful matriarch who saw Harem as a direct affront to tradition and a threat to her own power. The valide Sultan's ire was not a sudden burst of anger. It was a cold, calculating fury that had been simmering for months. She was a woman who had seen many concubines come and go. She had witnessed the rise and fall of favourites, and she had always maintained her position as the ultimate authority in the harem. But Harem was different. She was not content to be a temporary diversion. She was building a power base, and the Sultan was letting her do it. A mainstream historical fact about the valid Sultan is that her power was immense, often rivaling that of the Sultan himself. She was the one who managed the harem, the one who controlled its vast wealth and the careers of the eunuchs. She was the matriarch of the entire royal family, a figure of immense political and social authority. For Harem to challenge her was not just an act of defiance, it was a political earthquake. The Valide Sultan's displeasure was a palpable presence in the palace, a cold front that blew through the gilded corridors, making even the most loyal servants nervous. She began to use her influence to subtly turn the court against Harem. She would have private meetings with the viziers, hinting at Harem's unnatural influence over the Sultan, her foreign origins, and the danger of her growing power. She was a master of the whispered word, a puppeteer who could move the pieces on the chessboard without ever touching them. Harem, for her part, was not a helpless victim. She understood the game. She knew that her position was only as secure as the Sultan's affection, and that his mother's power was a force to be reckoned with. She also knew that the Valide Sultan's influence was based on tradition and established power, while her own was based on something far more volatile, love. It was a risky strategy, but it was the only one she had. She began to subtly counter the Valide Sultan's moves. She would use her charm and wit to win over the Sultan's friends and allies. She would show them that she was not a scheming sorceress, but a kind, intelligent, and fiercely loyal woman. She would use her growing influence to promote her own allies, people she could trust, into positions of power within the harem. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that she allegedly started a patronage system, where she would give gifts and support to the younger concubines and servants, creating a network of loyalty that bypassed the valide Sultan's authority. These women would then act as her eyes and ears, a silent army of informants. The friction between the two women came to a head during a particularly tense period in the Sultan's life. He was preparing for a major military campaign, a time when a ruler's household was supposed to be a place of quiet support and stability. The Valide Sultan, in a calculated move, began to subtly undermine Harem's authority. She would give conflicting orders, openly question Harem's decisions in front of the servants, and make sure that Harem's requests for supplies or staff were always delayed or denied. It was a war of attrition, a slow and steady erosion of Harem's power. The goal was simple: to make Harem so frustrated and powerless that she would either retreat into the shadows or, even better, do something rash that would earn her the Sultan's disfavour. But Harem, with her street smarts and her relentless spirit, refused to be broken. She used her wit and her humour to navigate the minefield. She would make a joke about the Valide Sultan's orders, a light-hearted comment that seemed to deflect the tension, but was, in reality, a quiet act of rebellion. The Valide Sultan, a woman with a great deal of pride, did not appreciate being the butt of a joke, even a private one. She saw it as a sign of disrespect, a challenge to her authority. The ultimate confrontation, a silent battle for the soul of the Sultan, took place in the form of a gift. The Valide Sultan, in a grand display of her power and her continued support for Mahidevran, organised a lavish gift for Prince Mustafa, Mahidevran's son, for his coming-of-age ceremony. It was a magnificent thing, a jewel-encrusted dagger, a symbol of his future as a warrior and a ruler. The gift was not just a present. It was a political statement, a clear sign that she saw Mustafa as the future Sultan. Harem, for her part, was not to be outdone. She also prepared a gift, but hers was a different kind of statement. Instead of a weapon, she presented the Sultan with a meticulously crafted book of poetry she had written herself, a collection of love poems and odes to his greatness. It was a gift that spoke not of war and power, but of love and companionship, a direct challenge to the Valide Sultan's focus on dynasty and tradition. Historians still argue whether Hürrem's poetry was truly her own, or if she had it ghost-written. The truth is that in a world where a concubine's education was often limited, her ability to write poetry of such high quality was a source of both admiration and suspicion. But for the Sultan, a lover of poetry and a man who saw himself as both a warrior and a poet, the gift was a powerful testament to their bond. He was moved by her words, a man who had everything, but who had found something new and precious in the heart of an enslaved woman. He publicly praised her gift, a quiet but firm rebuke to his mother's show of power. The Valide Sultan, for all her influence, could not compete with the Sultan's heart. She had tried to fight fire with fire, but Hürrem had used water, a soft and gentle force that had extinguished her rival's blaze. This incident was a turning point. It was not a decisive victory for Hürrem, but it was a clear signal that the Valide Sultan's power was no longer absolute. Hürrem was not just a favourite, she was a partner, a companion, a woman who could sway the Sultan's emotions and by extension his decisions. This was a radical departure from the established order. The jokes in the harem began to change again. Now they were not just about Hürrem's witchcraft, but about the Valide Sultan's frustration. "The old woman is so angry," one might whisper, "she's going to turn to stone." But the Valide Sultan was not so easily defeated. She knew that Hürrem's power based on emotion was fragile. A new concubine, a new war, a new political crisis. Any of these could turn the Sultan's heart away from her. She also knew that Hürrem had not yet given the Sultan a son. As long as Prince Mustafa was the only heir, Mahidevran and the Valide Sultan's position was secure. The battle was not over. It had simply entered a new, more dangerous phase. The Valide Sultan, with her decades of experience and her immense network of spies and allies, was a formidable opponent. She would not rest until Hürrem was either gone or at the very least stripped of her influence. She began to lay a new trap, a different kind of plot, one that was not based on poison, but on the very real dangers of court life. She would use Hürrem's own ambition against her, a slow, methodical game of chess that she was confident she would win. Hürrem, for her part, was aware of the danger. She knew that the Valide Sultan was a monster in her own right, a woman who would stop at nothing to protect her dynasty. But Hürrem had her own fire, her own stubborn will to survive. She was no longer a terrified girl from a small village. She was a woman who had tasted power and had no intention of giving it up. The rivalry between these two women, one a pillar of tradition and the other a force of change, was not just a personal feud. It was a clash of two different worlds, a battle for the soul of the Ottoman Empire itself. The monster in the Sultan's harem had just met her match, a monster of a different kind, and the stage was set for a conflict that would change the course of history. The Valide Sultan's constant pressure, the subtle undermining of her authority, and the lingering threat of Mahidevran's supporters were not just annoyances, they were existential threats. Hürrem, the girl who had survived a slave raid and a poisoning attempt, knew that she could not win this war alone. The Sultan's affection, while a powerful shield, was also a fragile one. The palace was a place of shifting alliances, and she needed a foundation of power that did not depend on the whims of a single man, no matter how magnificent he was. She needed allies, powerful ones, who could stand with her against the Valide Sultan and her formidable network. This was the moment she transitioned from a concubine seeking survival to a stateswoman building a base of power. Her first major move, a stroke of political genius that left the court reeling, was to forge a secret alliance with the Grand Vizier, Pargala Ibrahim Pasha. This was a man of immense power, a friend and confidant of the Sultan since childhood. He was a military genius, a statesman, and the second most powerful man in the empire. He was also a man who, like Hürrem, had risen from humble origins. He was born a Christian, a slave who had been taken into the palace, and, through sheer talent and charisma, had risen to the very top. He was in many ways Hürrem's male counterpart, an outsider who had captured the Sultan's trust and affection. The alliance was not an easy one. Pargala Ibrahim Pasha, a proud and ambitious man, initially viewed Hürrem with suspicion. He saw her as a frivolous distraction for the Sultan, a woman whose emotional hold over him could be a threat to the stability of the empire. He was a traditionalist in many ways, and believed that a sultan's affections should be temporary, a fleeting passion that did not interfere with the serious business of ruling. But Hürrem, a master of persuasion, knew how to appeal to his ambition. She approached him not with flattery, but with cold, hard logic. She argued that they had a common enemy in the Valide Sultan, a woman who wielded immense power and who was a constant threat to anyone who was not a part of the old established order. She pointed out that their power, his as the Grand Vizier and hers as the Sultan's favourite, was entirely dependent on Suleiman's trust. The Valide Sultan, with her deep roots and her support for the old ways, could easily turn the Sultan against them both. Historians still argue whether this alliance was based on genuine respect or a simple quid pro quo, a pact of convenience between two ambitious outsiders. The truth, as is often the case, is likely a mix of both. They were two people who understood the loneliness of power, the constant need for vigilance, and the absolute necessity of a trusted ally. A mainstream historical fact is that this alliance between Hürrem and Pagal Ibrahim Pasha was a significant event in Ottoman history, marking a new era of political intrigue where concubines and viziers worked together to secure their positions. The Valide Sultan, with her network of spies and informants, was not oblivious to these meetings. She saw the two outsiders talking, whispering in the private gardens of the palace, and her fury grew. She saw it as a conspiracy, a direct challenge to her authority. She began to use her influence to turn the Sultan against his Grand Vizier, subtly planting seeds of doubt about Ibrahim's loyalty and his growing ambition. She would remind the Sultan of the power of the Janissaries, the elite military force that Ibrahim commanded, and she would hint at the danger of a vizier who was becoming too popular, too powerful. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, and it was a dangerous one. But Hürrem and Ibrahim were not easily divided. They understood the Valide Sultan's game, and they began to counter her moves. Hürrem would use her time with the Sultan to praise Ibrahim, to speak of his loyalty and his wisdom. She would present his political and military successes as proof of his unwavering dedication to the Sultan. Ibrahim, for his part, would use his power to support Hürrem's initiatives. He would ensure that her requests for supplies were met, that her projects were funded, and that her allies were promoted. This was the birth of the so-called Sultanate of Women, a period where women of the harem began to wield unprecedented political power. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Hürrem and Ibrahim allegedly had a secret code, a series of hand signals and phrases they would use in public to communicate without arousing suspicion. It was a way for them to convey information and coordinate their efforts under the watchful eyes of the Valide Sultan and her spies. The palace, which had once been a place of open displays of power, was now a place of silent, secret communication, a labyrinth of hidden meanings and veiled words. The jokes in the harem began to reflect this new reality. The red-haired one and the Greek one are working together, one might whisper. Who knew they would make such a pair? The alliance had its first major victory during a crucial military campaign. The Sultan, remember, was a warrior, a man who led his armies from the front. During a long and difficult siege, the Janissaries, under Ibrahim's command, were instrumental in a key victory. The Valide Sultan, ever the schemer, had tried to downplay Ibrahim's role, crediting the victory to the Sultan's generalship. But Hürrem, in a series of carefully crafted letters to the Sultan, praised Ibrahim's courage and his tactical genius, reminding the Sultan of the debt he owed to his Grand Vizier. The Sultan, who trusted Hürrem implicitly, saw her words as an honest assessment, a counterbalance to his mother's political manoeuvring. He publicly honoured Ibrahim, showering him with gifts and praise, a clear sign that the Valide Sultan's attempts to undermine him had failed. This was a profound moment for both Hürrem and Ibrahim. It proved that their alliance was effective, that together they could withstand the immense pressure of the Valide Sultan. For Hürrem, it was a validation of her political instincts. She was no longer just a concubine, she was a political strategist, a woman who could play the game of thrones with the best of them. The Valide Sultan, for her part, was enraged. She had seen her power challenged, and she had lost. She was no longer the undisputed queen of the palace. She had a rival, a younger, more ambitious woman who had a powerful man by her side. The war between the two women had entered a new, more dangerous phase. Hürrem had survived a poisoning attempt, a physical attack, and the constant pressure of the Valide Sultan. But in forging this alliance with Pagal Ibrahim Pasha, she had done something far more dangerous. She had inserted herself directly into the political life of the empire. She was no longer a passive player, she was an active participant, a woman who was shaping the future of a dynasty. The monster in the Sultan's harem was not just a myth anymore. She was a reality, a force of nature that was changing the very fabric of the Ottoman court. And the Valide Sultan, for all her power and her cunning, was about to find out just how formidable this new monster truly was. With her alliance with Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha solidified, Hürrem's influence was no longer a matter of whispered conjecture. It was a visible, undeniable fact. The whispers of power began to change their tone, morphing from nervous gossip into a genuine, and sometimes terrified, recognition of her authority. She was no longer just the Sultan's favourite. She was the architect of a new political faction, a power broker who had the ear of both the Sultan and his Grand Vizier. The harem, a place that had always been the Valide Sultan's private domain, now had a co-regent, a younger, more ambitious woman who was not afraid to challenge the old guard. This was the period where the accusations of witchcraft reached a fever pitch. In the absence of a logical explanation for her meteoric rise, Hürrem's enemies, led by the furious Valide Sultan, resorted to the oldest and most dangerous weapon in their arsenal, superstition. They claimed she had used sorcery to bewitch the Sultan, to cloud his judgment and turn his heart away from his traditional duties and toward her. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the period's folk stories and gossip is that it was believed she had a hidden book of spells, a kind of dark grimoire she had brought with her from her homeland. These stories passed from servant to servant, from the harem to the city, painted her as a succubus, a monstrous figure who had bewitched the great Sultan Suleiman. The jokes about her hair, once a source of nervous laughter, were now replaced by dark, uneasy whispers. They would say, "The red-haired one has the devil's fire in her veins." The accusations were not just empty words, they were a deliberate political strategy. The Valide Sultan understood that in a deeply religious and superstitious society, a charge of witchcraft could be a death sentence. She began to subtly encourage these rumours, using her vast network to spread the idea that Hürrem's influence was not just political, but magical. She even brought in some of the more conservative religious scholars to the palace, men who she knew would be horrified by Hürrem's unconventional rise and her open engagement in political matters. These scholars, in their sermons and their private conversations, would subtly allude to the dangers of unholy influence in the Sultan's court, a veiled but unmistakable attack on Hürrem. Hürrem, however, was not one to cower in the face of such a campaign. She knew that to deny the accusations was to give them power. Instead, she chose a more subtle and ultimately more effective strategy. She began to use her influence to promote religious and charitable causes. She built mosques, funded public soup kitchens, and established hospitals and schools. A mainstream historical fact is that Hürrem's architectural projects, particularly the Haseki Hürrem Sultan complex, were some of the most significant of the period. This was not just an act of piety, it was a brilliant political move. By funding these projects, she was not only demonstrating her faith and her commitment to the welfare of the people, but she was also building a public image that directly contradicted the rumours of her being a malevolent witch. How could a woman who built mosques and helped the poor be a servant of the devil? The Valide Sultan, for her part, was furious. She had tried to cast Hürrem as a monster, but Hürrem was reframing the narrative, portraying herself as a benefactor, a compassionate ruler, and a devout Muslim. The battle for public opinion had begun, and Hürrem, with her generous heart and her political acumen, was winning. This was a crucial turning point. Hürrem was not just fighting for her life in the palace. She was fighting for her reputation in the eyes of the people. She understood that a ruler's power, even an unofficial one, was based not just on military might or political alliances, but on the love and respect of the populace. She was creating a legacy, a public image that would outlive her enemies and secure her place in history. Her alliance with Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha was also paying dividends. Ibrahim, a man of immense power, was her rock, her partner in the great game of thrones. He would use his position to ensure that her projects were funded and her enemies were kept at bay. He was a ruthless and pragmatic man, and he saw in Hürrem a woman who could be a valuable ally in his own quest for power. The two of them, the Grand Vizier and the Sultan's favourite, were an unstoppable team, and their combined power was a force that the Valide Sultan, for all her cunning, could not withstand. Historians still argue whether Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha was a true friend to Hürrem, or if he was simply using her for his own political gain. The truth, as is often the case, is likely a complex mix of both. They were two outsiders who had found a way to survive and thrive in a hostile environment, and their alliance was based on a mutual understanding of the dangers they faced. They were bound not just by a shared ambition, but by a shared vulnerability. The Valide Sultan's campaign of whispers and rumours was starting to lose its power. Hürrem's good deeds, her mosques and her charities, were a living testament to her goodness, a powerful counter-narrative to the dark stories her enemies were spreading. The Sultan, who was a deeply religious man, was also deeply impressed by Hürrem's piety and her generosity. He saw in her not a monster, but a queen in the making, a woman who cared not just for his affection, but for the welfare of his people. He began to give her more and more power, allowing her to control the vast wealth of the harem and to manage her own court. This was a radical departure from tradition. A concubine, a former slave, was now acting as a queen, a partner in the rule of the empire. It was an unprecedented move, and it sent shockwaves through the conservative court. The Valide Sultan and her allies were horrified. They saw it as a sign that the Sultan was losing his mind, that he was so bewitched by this foreign woman that he was willing to abandon centuries of tradition. They began to plot a more direct, a more dangerous attack. The whispers of witchcraft, the subtle undermining, had failed. They needed a new plan, one that would remove Hürrem from power permanently. The jokes in the harem, which had been a nervous coping mechanism, began to take on a new, more confident tone. The Valide Sultan has the power of the past, one might whisper, but Hürrem has the power of the future. It was a joke that carried a deep and profound truth. The old ways were dying, and a new, more powerful force was rising to take their place. The monster in the Sultan's harem was not a monster at all, but a revolutionary, a woman who was quietly but relentlessly changing the world around her. She had survived slavery, poison, and a campaign of whispers. She had forged an alliance with the most powerful man in the empire, and had used her newfound power to become a benefactor to the people. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a force of nature, a woman who was rewriting the rules of power, one mosque and one hospital at a time. The whispers of power were now her whispers, and the future of the empire was now, in a very real way, in her hands. The whispers of Hürrem's power had grown into a roar, a new and unsettling sound in the halls of the Topkapi Palace. But as Hürrem's star ascended, the health of the Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, began to wane. This was not a sudden illness, but a slow, creeping decline, a gradual dimming of the fierce light that had burned so brightly for so long. Suleiman had spent his life on campaign, leading his armies across Europe and Asia, and the physical toll of a lifetime of warfare and travel began to catch up with him. He was a man in his prime, but the years of constant strain, the physical and emotional exhaustion of ruling a vast empire, were a cruel and relentless adversary. The Sultan's decline, a mainstream historical fact that marked a significant turning point in the empire's history, was a source of immense anxiety for everyone in the palace. For Hürrem, it was a terrifying prospect. Her power was almost entirely dependent on the Sultan's affection and his continued reign. If he were to die, the old rules of the Ottoman succession would kick in, and the fate of Hürrem and her children would be in the hands of his heir, Prince Mustafa, the son of her rival, Mahidevran. Mustafa was a popular and charismatic prince, a military man in the mould of his father. He was a favourite of the Janissaries, the elite military force, and he had the support of the Valide Sultan and her powerful network. The political climate of the palace, always tense, now became a pressure cooker of ambition and fear. Every cough, every moment of weakness from the Sultan was a subject of frantic gossip. The doctors, under constant pressure from the Valide Sultan and her allies, would issue careful, reassuring statements, but the truth was an open secret. The great Suleiman was not invincible. For Hürrem, this was a race against time. She had to secure her children's future, and her own, before the inevitable happened. She had no time for jokes or witty asides. This was a matter of life and death. Her alliance with Pagala Ibrahim Pasha, her rock in the storm, was now more important than ever. She and Ibrahim began to work together, not just to counter the Valide Sultan, but to prepare for a post-Suleiman world. They knew that if Prince Mustafa ascended the throne, their lives would be forfeit. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide, where a new sultan would often kill his brothers to prevent a succession war, was a brutal and terrifying reality. Mustafa, for all his popularity, would have no choice but to eliminate his rivals, and Hurrem's sons, as the Sultan's other male children, were his most dangerous rivals. Hurrem began to use her influence to subtly promote her own sons, particularly her eldest, Shehzada Mehmed. She would arrange for the Sultan to spend more time with Mehmed, to teach him about governance and military strategy. She would praise his intelligence and his charisma, subtly contrasting him with Mustafa, who she would paint as a bit too much of a traditionalist, a man of the old ways who might not be able to navigate the complex world of modern politics. A fringe tidbit from historical accounts is that Hurrem allegedly commissioned poets and artists to create works that subtly praised Mehmed and his potential as a future ruler, a kind of early modern propaganda campaign. These poems and paintings would then be accidentally left in places where the Sultan would be sure to see them. The Valid Sultan and her faction were not blind to these machinations. They saw Hurrem's every move as a desperate attempt to undermine the rightful heir. They in turn began their own campaign to promote Mustafa. They would arrange for the Janissaries to praise him, for the religious scholars to speak of his piety and his dedication to the traditions of the empire. The palace became a silent battlefield, where two factions, one led by an old traditionalist matriarch and the other by a young ambitious outsider, were fighting for the future of a dynasty. Historians still argue whether Suleiman was truly oblivious to these machinations, or if he was simply allowing them to play out, a kind of test for his sons and his inner circle. The truth is that Suleiman was a wise and experienced ruler, and he was likely aware of the rivalries and the plots. But he was also a man torn between two loves, his love for Hurrem and his love for the traditions of his empire. He was a man of immense power, but in this one area he was almost powerless. He could not stop the inevitable march of time, and he could not stop the brutal laws of succession. The Sultan's physical decline was a backdrop to a growing political crisis. The Janissaries, the powerful military force, were a constant source of anxiety. They were loyal to Mustafa, their warrior prince, and they saw Hurrem and her faction as a threat to their power and their traditions. They were the ones who had a say in who would be the next Sultan, and their support for Mustafa was a formidable obstacle for Hurrem. A mainstream historical fact is that the Janissaries, who were once a loyal military force, had become a powerful political faction, and their approval was essential for any new sultan to be legitimate. Hurrem's position was now more precarious than ever. She had survived a poisoning attempt, but she was now in a race against time, fighting not just for her own life, but for the lives of her children. She knew that if Suleiman died before she could secure her children's future, they would be killed, and she would be exiled, a fate worse than death. The jokes and light-hearted asides were long gone. This was a grim and desperate struggle, a game of life and death where the stakes were the highest they could be. Hurrem and Ibrahim, her Grand Vizier ally, began to work on a new plan, one that was both audacious and dangerous. They decided that they had to find a way to undermine Mustafa's position, to turn the Sultan against his own son. It was a risky strategy, and it was one that would require immense cunning and a willingness to do things that would forever stain their reputations. They were no longer just survivors, they were conspirators, men and women who were willing to do anything to win. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now fully formed, a woman who was willing to play a game of thrones with the lives of her own stepson and her rival. She was a woman who was fighting for her life, for the lives of her children, and for the future of an empire. And she would not stop until she had won. The decline of the Sultan was not just an end. It was a new beginning, a new and terrifying chapter in the life of Hurrem and the history of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan's death, when it finally arrived, was not a peaceful passing, but a violent, seismic event that ripped through the very fabric of the Ottoman court. Suleiman the Magnificent, a man who had been a constant for decades, was gone. His last breath was not a sigh of relief, but a signal for a brutal and vicious power struggle to begin. The air in the palace, already thick with tension, became electric with fear and ambition. This was the moment Hurrem had been dreading, the moment her life's work would either be solidified or destroyed. The traditional rules of succession were clear, and in their brutal simplicity they were terrifying. The eldest son, Prince Mustafa, was the rightful heir, but the reality was far more complex. The Janissaries, the elite military force, had the power to confirm or deny the new sultan. They were a king-making body, and their loyalty was to Mustafa, their warrior prince. The Valide Sultan and her faction, remember, had spent years cultivating their support. They saw Mustafa as the natural successor, a man in the mould of his father, a warrior who would lead them to new conquests. Hürrem's sons, on the other hand, were seen as a threat, a challenge to the established order. The power struggle began not with a battle, but with a race. The first to arrive in Istanbul and secure the support of the Janissaries would be the new Sultan. Hürrem's sons, still young and relatively inexperienced, were at a disadvantage. Mustafa, with his years of military experience and his immense popularity, was the clear favourite. The Valid Sultan, in a shrewd and ruthless move, immediately took control of the palace's inner workings, her old network of spies and allies now operating with the full authority of the state. She began to issue orders, to spread rumours, to ensure that the path to the throne was clear for her grandson. Hürrem, for her part, was not a helpless bystander. The alliance she had forged with Pagala Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, was now her greatest asset. Ibrahim, a man of immense power and political cunning, had been preparing for this moment for years. He and Hürrem had a plan, a dangerous and audacious one that hinged on a deep and troubling secret about the Sultan's death. The official story was that Suleiman had died of natural causes, a noble end for a great ruler. But Hürrem and Ibrahim, with their own network of spies and doctors, knew the truth. Suleiman had not died peacefully. He had been poisoned. This was a fringe tidbit, a rumour that was never proven, but was whispered in the shadows of the palace for years. The poison was a slow-acting one that mimicked the symptoms of a natural decline. The motive, they believed, was to create a succession crisis, a chaotic environment in which a powerful faction could seize control. Historians still argue whether Suleiman was truly poisoned, or if it was a political fiction concocted by Hürrem and Ibrahim to serve their own ends. The truth is lost to time, but the belief in the poisoning, whether real or not, was a powerful weapon. Ibrahim, using his authority as Grand Vizier, began a secret investigation, a search for the conspirators. He and Hürrem, working in the shadows, began to gather evidence, to build a case that would turn the Janissaries against their beloved prince. They would not accuse Mustafa directly, but they would accuse his mother, Mahidevran, and her faction. They would argue that the poisoning was an act of desperation, a last-ditch attempt to secure the throne for Mustafa by removing his father. This was a dangerous game, and it was a game that was not without its casualties. The Valide Sultan, a woman of immense pride and power, was not about to let a couple of outsiders destroy her grandson's chance at the throne. She saw Hürrem's machinations for what they were, a desperate and cynical ploy. She and her faction began to counter Hürrem's moves, to spread their own rumours, their own stories. The jokes in the harem, which had been a nervous coping mechanism, were now gone. The palace was a place of quiet, murderous intent. The climax of the power struggle came during a tense and dramatic meeting of the Divan, the Imperial Council. The council was to choose a new Grand Vizier and to decide the fate of the empire. Mustafa's supporters, a powerful and vocal group, were there in force, demanding that their prince be brought to Istanbul and be crowned. The Valide Sultan, a silent but powerful presence, watched with cold, hard eyes. But then, in a stunning and audacious move, Pagala Ibrahim Pasha, with Hürrem's full backing, presented his evidence of the poisoning. He did not name names, but he spoke of a conspiracy, a plot that had ended the life of the great Suleiman. He spoke of the need for an investigation, for a time of mourning and reflection, a time when a new sultan should not be crowned. His words had a profound effect. The Janissaries, for all their love of Mustafa, were fiercely loyal to the memory of Suleiman. The idea that their sultan, their magnificent leader, had been murdered in his own palace was a horrifying prospect. They demanded an investigation. They demanded that the conspirators be brought to justice. In this moment of chaos and uncertainty, Pagala Ibrahim Pasha, with Hürrem's quiet support, seized control. He postponed the coronation, a brilliant political move that gave them time to consolidate their power. The Valide Sultan and her faction were in disarray. Their plan had been to have Mustafa crowned immediately, to present the empire with a fait accompli. But Hürrem and Ibrahim had stopped them. The power struggle, which had been a clear and simple battle for the throne, had become a complex and murky conspiracy. A mainstream historical fact is that this period of instability and political manoeuvring after the death of Suleiman was a crucial turning point in Ottoman history, a time when the rules of succession were bent and broken, and when the power of the Grand Vizier and the Sultan's favourite reached an unprecedented level. The monster in the Sultan's harem was no longer a monster. She was a queen, a woman who had, through a combination of political genius and ruthless ambition, stopped a coup and saved her children's lives. The death of the Sultan had not destroyed her, it had unleashed her. She and Ibrahim, with the support of the Janissaries, were now the de facto rulers of the empire. They had time, and time was their greatest weapon. They would use it to undermine Mustafa, to turn the people against him, and to ensure that when the time came to choose a new sultan, it would be one of Hurrem's sons. The vicious power struggle had just begun, and Hurrem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, and she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The chaos of the Sultan's death had been a crucible, and from its fiery heart, Hurrem and Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha had emerged victorious, at least for the moment, but their triumph was a fragile thing, a temporary stay of execution in a game with deadly stakes. The postponement of Prince Mustafa's coronation was a brilliant political manoeuvre, but it was not a permanent solution. The Janissaries, for all their loyalty to Suleiman, were still fiercely devoted to Mustafa. He was their hero, their warrior prince. As the investigation into the alleged poisoning of the Sultan dragged on, the popular opinion began to turn. The people, who had loved Suleiman, began to question why his son, his rightful heir, was being kept from the throne. They saw it not as a conspiracy to find the truth, but as a conspiracy to usurp the throne. The Valide Sultan, a woman of immense cunning and a deep understanding of the hearts of the people, seized on this. She began a subtle but effective campaign to paint Hurrem and Ibrahim as power-hungry usurpers. She would quietly fund religious scholars who would give sermons about the importance of tradition and the dangers of a sultan's heart being swayed by a foreign woman. She would use her network of spies and allies to spread rumours about Hurrem's witchcraft and Ibrahim's unholy ambition. The jokes in the city, which had once been about the Valide Sultan's frustration, now took on a more sinister tone. They would say, "The red-haired one has bewitched the Grand Vizier as well." The pressure on Hurrem and Ibrahim became immense. Their power was based on a lie, on a political fiction about a poisoning that they could never truly prove. The Grand Vizier, a pragmatic and ruthless man, began to feel the weight of his decision. He knew that the Janissaries, if pushed too far, would revolt. A Janissary uprising, a mainstream historical fact that had toppled sultans in the past, was the one thing that could destroy them all. He began to suggest that they should end their campaign against Mustafa and simply accept him as the new sultan, a move that would have meant certain death for Hurrem and her children. But Hurrem, the girl who had survived a slave raid, was not one to give up. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to simply surrender. She knew that if Mustafa became sultan, her children would be killed and she would be exiled, a fate worse than death. She refused to accept this grim reality. Her relationship with Ibrahim, once a rock-solid alliance, began to fray. He saw her as reckless, a woman who was willing to risk the stability of the empire for her own personal ambitions. She saw him as a coward, a man who was willing to sacrifice her and her children to save his own skin. In a move that would shock the entire court, Hurrem made a desperate and dangerous decision. She arranged for a meeting with a group of the most powerful and conservative viziers, men who she knew were fiercely loyal to tradition and who distrusted both her and Ibrahim. She did not appeal to them with flattery or charm. She appealed to their pragmatism. She argued that Ibrahim, with his immense power and his control of the Janissaries, was a threat to their own positions. She told them that he was becoming too powerful, too ambitious, a man who was not a vizier, but a sultan in his own right. This was a dangerous gamble, a direct attack on her own ally, and it was a move that could have backfired spectacularly. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Hurrem, during this meeting, allegedly presented a fabricated letter, a letter from Ibrahim to a foreign power, in which he spoke of his desire to rule the empire himself. The letter was a masterful forgery, a work of fiction that was designed to play on the vizier's fears and their hatred of a powerful vizier. The viziers, a group of men who had long been suspicious of Ibrahim's power, were easily swayed. They saw the letter as proof of his treachery, and they began to turn against him. The alliance between Hurrem and Ibrahim, the rock of her power, was now shattered. The viziers, with their newfound confidence, went to the Janissaries and began to plant seeds of doubt about Ibrahim's loyalty. They argued that he was not a friend of the people, but a man who was using them for his own personal gain. The Janissaries, a proud and fiercely independent group, were swayed. They saw Ibrahim not as their leader, but as a potential tyrant. In a moment of supreme irony, the man who had been Hurrem's greatest ally was now her greatest enemy. The fallout was swift and brutal. Ibrahim, in a stunning and tragic turn of events, was murdered in his own home. The assassins were not Hurrem's men, but a group of Janissaries who had been convinced of his treachery. The death of the Grand Vizier, a man who had been a friend of the Sultan for decades, was a political earthquake. It left a power vacuum at the heart of the empire, a void that Hurrem was now perfectly positioned to fill. With Ibrahim gone, the only remaining power was the Valide Sultan, and her faction was now in disarray. Hurrem, the girl who had been a slave, was now a true queen. She was the one who controlled the vast wealth of the harem, the one who had the ear of the new sultan. She was not the sultan herself, but she was a power behind the throne, a woman who could bend the wills of men to her own. But her victory came at a terrible price. She had destroyed her greatest ally, and she had done so with a lie. She was now a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a monster, not because of her foreignness or her red hair, but because of her ruthless and cold-blooded ambition. Historians still argue whether Hurrem was directly responsible for Ibrahim's death, or if she was simply a woman who created a situation in which his death was inevitable. The truth is that Hurrem, in her quest for power, had crossed a line. She had gone from a survivor to a conspirator, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to win. The exile of Mahidevran, the mother of the Sultan's heir, was not a victory for Hurrem. It was a consequence of her cold-blooded ambition. Mahidevran, with her son gone, was a broken woman. She was exiled from the court and sent to a remote corner of the empire, a quiet and miserable end for a woman who had once been the most powerful woman in the harem. Hurrem, the girl who had been a slave, had not just survived, she had triumphed. But her victory was a hollow one. She had secured her children's future, but she had lost her greatest friend and her own soul. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now a reality, a woman who was feared by everyone, a woman who had become a legend in her own time. She was a queen, yes, but she was also alone. The power struggle had just begun, and Hurrem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, and she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The death of Pagala Ibrahim Pasha was a turning point of monumental proportions. It was a political assassination that left a gaping hole in the power structure of the Ottoman Empire, and Hurrem, the woman who had orchestrated it, was now perfectly positioned to fill the void. The vicious power struggle had been won, and with Mahidevran exiled and Ibrahim gone, the path was cleared for Hurrem to finally secure her children's future. But the throne was not yet Hurrem's. A new sultan, a young and inexperienced one, had been placed on the throne. He was a son of Hurrem's, but he was not yet a ruler in his own right, and his mother, the new Valide Sultan, was a formidable foe. This new sultan, a mainstream historical fact, was Shehzadeh Selim. He was not the charismatic, warrior-like figure his father had been. He was a man of letters, a lover of poetry and wine, a man who had become known as Selim the Sot. He was a quiet, introverted figure who preferred the pleasures of the palace to the rigours of the battlefield. He was a perfect puppet for Hurrem, a son who was fiercely loyal to his mother and who would do her bidding without question. This was Hurrem's greatest triumph, the moment her long and brutal struggle for power came to fruition. She had not just survived, she had won. But victory, as Hurrem knew, was a fragile thing. The palace was a place of endless intrigue, and a new rival was always lurking in the shadows. This new rival was not a concubine, but a powerful and ambitious woman who was now the Valide Sultan, the new sultan's mother. The old Valide Sultan had been a woman of tradition, a woman who had tried to maintain the old order. The new Valide Sultan, a woman named Afife, was a different kind of monster. She was a woman who had seen Hurrem's rise and fall, and she was a woman who was not about to let Hurrem's power go unchallenged. The Valide Sultan, remember, held immense power. She controlled the finances of the harem, the appointments of the eunuchs, and the education of the royal children. She was the matriarch of the dynasty, and her power was absolute. Afif, the new Valide Sultan, was a woman who was loyal to Hurrem, but she was also a woman who was fiercely ambitious. She saw Hurrem's power as a threat to her own, and she began a subtle and dangerous campaign to undermine her. She would use her control of the palace's finances to quietly starve Hurrem's charities and projects. She would use her influence with the eunuchs to delay Hurrem's requests for staff and supplies. It was a cold war, a battle of wills between two powerful women, and Hurrem, for the first time in her life, was on the defensive. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the new Valid Sultan, a fief, was allegedly a fan of a particular kind of folk magic, a kind of magic that was meant to protect her and her son from Hurrem's witchcraft. She would have special amulets and charms made for her son, amulets that were meant to protect him from Hurrem's influence. This was not a real threat, of course, but it was a sign of the paranoia and the fear that still lingered in the palace. Hurrem, for her part, was not afraid. She had faced down far greater threats in her life. She knew that a fief was a woman who could be reasoned with, a woman who was not a monster, but a woman who was simply trying to protect her own position. She chose a different strategy. Instead of fighting with a fief, she decided to befriend her. She would invite her to her private chambers to talk not as rivals, but as two powerful women who had a shared interest in the stability of the dynasty. She would praise a fief's wisdom and her piety. She would share her own stories of her struggles and her fears. This was a brilliant political maneuver, a kind of psychological warfare that was designed to disarm a fief and to win her over. Historians still argue whether Hurrem's friendship with the new Valid Sultan was genuine or a simple political ploy. The truth is that Hurrem, a woman who had been a slave, a concubine and a queen, had a deep and profound understanding of human nature. She knew that power was a lonely thing, and she knew that a fief, for all her ambition, was also a woman who was struggling to navigate the treacherous waters of the palace. She saw in a fief not a rival, but a potential ally, and she was right. The two women, the old queen and the new, began to form an unlikely alliance. They would work together to manage the palace, to ensure the stability of the dynasty, and to protect the new sultan from the enemies who were still lurking in the shadows. This was a mainstream historical fact, the rise of two powerful women who were able to work together, a partnership that was unheard of in the annals of Ottoman history. The jokes in the harem, which had been a nervous coping mechanism, began to reflect this new reality. They would say, the red-haired one and the new queen are two peas in a pod. But the alliance was not without its challenges. The Valide Sultan, a traditionalist at heart, was a constant source of friction. She would often clash with Hurrem over the appointment of officials, the funding of projects, and the education of the royal children. Hurrem, with her progressive ideas and her ambitious plans, was a constant source of frustration for the old guard. She would often push for new and radical ideas, ideas that were meant to modernize the empire and to make it more powerful. A fief, a woman who was more conservative, would often resist, a kind of passive-aggressive resistance that was designed to slow Hurrem down. The new sultan, Selim, was a quiet and often passive figure, a man who preferred to let the women in his life rule. He was a puppet, a figurehead, who was happy to let his mother and his wife run the empire. This was Hurrem's greatest triumph and her greatest curse. She had won, yes, but she had won a man who was not a sultan, but a boy. She was now a queen, yes, but she was a queen who was forced to rule from the shadows, a woman who was not in charge of her own destiny, but a woman who was in charge of the destiny of a dynasty. The power struggle, which had been a clear and simple battle for the throne, had become a complex and murky web of alliances and betrayals. Hurrem, the girl who had been a slave, was now a queen, a woman who had secured her children's future and her own power. But her victory came at a terrible price. She had destroyed her greatest ally, and she had done so with a lie. She was now a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a monster, not because of her foreignness or her red hair, but because of her ruthless and cold-blooded ambition. The power struggle had just begun, and Hurrem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, and she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. Hurrem's victory had been hard won, a brutal struggle that had cost her dearly. Now, with a son on the throne and a new uneasy alliance with the new Valid Sultan, Afif, she could finally turn her attention to the most important legacy of all, her children. In the brutal world of Ottoman succession, children were not just symbols of love, they were pawns in a deadly game. Hurrem had several sons, a mainstream historical fact, and each of them represented a different kind of hope and a different kind of danger. Her eldest, Selim, was now the Sultan, but he was a quiet, introverted man who was ill-suited to the demands of the throne. He was a poet and a lover of wine, a man who preferred the pleasures of the palace to the rigours of the battlefield. He was a puppet, a figurehead, and he was fiercely loyal to his mother. But Hurrem's other sons were a different story. They were ambitious, charismatic, and they had inherited their father's warrior spirit. The most prominent among them was Shehzadeh Bayezid, a man who was everything his brother Selim was not. He was a brilliant military strategist, a fierce leader, and a man who was deeply respected by the Janissaries and the people. He was a man who in any other time would have been the natural heir to the throne. But with Selim as the Sultan, Bayezid was a threat, a rival who could at any moment be a source of a new and even more brutal power struggle. Hurrem, the woman who had fought so hard to secure her children's future, was now faced with a terrible new reality. Her sons, the very reason she had fought, were now rivals. She loved them all, but she knew that in the world of the Ottoman court, love was a dangerous luxury. She had to choose, and her choice would be a cruel and brutal one. She had to choose a side, and she had to ensure that her chosen son, the one who she believed was the best choice for the empire, would be the one to rule. This was a grim and terrible responsibility, one that would make her a monster in the eyes of history. The palace, which had been a place of quiet intrigue, now became a place of open rivalry between the brothers. Selim, with his quiet nature, was a tool of Hurrem, a man who would do her bidding without question. Bayezid, with his warrior spirit, was a man who would challenge his brother and his mother for the throne. The two brothers, remember, were not just rivals for the throne, they were rivals for their mother's affection. Selim, with his quiet nature, was a man who desperately sought his mother's approval. Bayezid, with his warrior spirit, was a man who was deeply proud, a man who believed that he was the rightful heir. Hurrem, for her part, was torn. She loved them both, but she knew that in the world of the Ottoman court love was not enough. She had to choose a successor, a man who would be able to rule the empire with wisdom and strength. She saw in Selim a man who was easily controlled, a man who would allow her to continue to rule from the shadows. She saw in Bayezid a man who was a potential rival, a man who would challenge her authority and her power. Her choice, a cruel and brutal one, was made not out of love, but out of a cold and ruthless ambition. She chose Selim. The campaign to undermine Bayezid was a silent and subtle one. Hurrem began to use her influence to promote Selim, to paint him as a wise and pious ruler, a man who was a poet and a lover of peace. She would use her control of the palace's finances to quietly fund Selim's projects and his charities. She would use her influence with the Janissaries to spread rumours about Bayezid's reckless nature and his fiery temper. She would portray Bayezid not as a warrior, but as a dangerous and ambitious rebel, a man who would tear the empire apart with his constant wars and his endless ambition. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Hurrem allegedly commissioned a series of satirical poems and plays that were meant to mock Bayezid and his ambitions. These plays, which were performed in the private chambers of the palace, were a masterful work of propaganda, a way for Hurrem to subtly undermine her son's reputation, without ever having to openly challenge him. These plays, which were filled with clever jokes and witty asides, were a way for Hurrem to make her son, Bayezid, a figure of ridicule, a man who was not to be taken seriously. Historians still argue whether Hurrem's choice of Selim over Bayezid was a deliberate act of fratricide or a simple political manoeuvre. The truth is that Hurrem, a woman who had been a slave, a concubine, and a queen, had a deep and profound understanding of the brutal and unforgiving nature of the Ottoman succession. She knew that in a world where there could only be one sultan, a choice had to be made, and she had made it. She had chosen the path of caution over the path of ambition, and she had chosen her own survival over the lives of her children. The rivalry between the brothers came to a head during a particularly tense period in the empire's history. The Janissaries, a powerful and fiercely independent military force, were growing restless. They were unhappy with Selim's quiet, introverted nature, and they were unhappy with the power of Hurrem, the woman who they saw as a foreign interloper. They began to openly support Bayezid, their warrior prince, a man who they believed was the rightful heir to the throne. The palace was now a place of open conflict, with two factions, one led by Selim and Hurrem, and the other led by Bayezid and the Janissaries, vying for control. Hurrem, in a final and desperate move, was forced to make a choice. She could either allow the rivalry to continue, a rivalry that would tear the empire apart, or she could do what she had to do. She chose the latter. She used her influence with the Divan, the Imperial Council, to have Bayezid declared a rebel, a man who had challenged the authority of the Sultan. She then sent her son Selim with a large army to hunt down and kill his brother. The battle that followed, a brutal and bloody affair, was a testament to the terrible and unforgiving nature of the Ottoman succession. Bayezid, for all his military genius, was no match for the combined forces of the empire. He was defeated and he was captured. The end of Bayezid, a tragic and brutal story, was Hürrem's greatest triumph and her greatest shame. She had secured her children's future, but she had done so at the cost of her own son's life. She was a woman who was a mother, a lover, and a queen, but she was also a monster, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to win. The power struggle had just begun, and Hürrem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, and she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The fratricidal war between Selim and Bayezid, a tragic and bloody chapter in Ottoman history, had been a brutal crucible. From its depths, Selim emerged as the undisputed Sultan, and Hürrem, the architect of his victory, was now the power behind the throne, a de facto ruler in her own right. But the peace was a fragile thing, a temporary calm before a new and even more terrifying storm. The Janissaries, the elite military force that had once been the kingmakers of the empire, were not happy. They had supported Bayezid, their warrior prince, and they saw his defeat and his eventual execution as an affront to their honour. They saw Hürrem not as a queen, but as a treacherous foreign interloper who had used her witch-like powers to turn the brothers against each other. The Janissary uprising, a mainstream historical fact that had toppled sultans in the past, was a terrifying prospect. The Janissaries were not just a military force, they were a political faction, a powerful and fiercely independent group that had the power to make or break a sultan. They were a constant source of anxiety, and their discontent was a clear and present danger to the new regime. Hürrem, the woman who had fought so hard to secure her children's future, was now faced with a new and terrifying reality. She had to find a way to control the Janissaries, to either win their loyalty or to destroy their power. The rebellion began not with a battle, but with a symbolic act of defiance. The Janissaries, in a show of their displeasure, began to refuse their pay. They would march through the streets of Istanbul, their drums beating a rhythmic, ominous rhythm, their voices raised in a unified chant of protest. They would demand that the new Sultan, Selim, be more like his father, a warrior who would lead them to new conquests and new glories. They would openly praise the memory of Bayezid, their fallen prince, and they would openly mock Selim, their quiet, introverted ruler. They were not just a military force, they were a political movement, a force of rebellion that was gaining traction among the people. Hürrem, the woman who had a deep and profound understanding of the hearts of the people, knew that this was not a battle that could be won with force. She knew that the Janissaries, with their immense popularity and their fierce loyalty, were a force that could not be easily defeated. She chose a different path, a more subtle and a more dangerous one. She decided to use the one weapon that she had always used to win, her intelligence. She began to use her network of spies and informants to gather information about the Janissaries, about their leaders, about their finances, and about their plans. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that she allegedly had a number of female spies, women who were not part of the harem, but who were part of the bustling city of Istanbul. These women, a kind of network of spies, would listen to the gossip in the markets, in the bathhouses, and in the coffee shops. They would then report back to Hürrem, giving her a constant stream of information about the mood of the people and the plans of the Janissaries. The information she gathered was a treasure trove. She discovered that the Janissaries, for all their talk of loyalty and tradition, were a deeply corrupt organisation. Their leaders were rich, lazy men who were more interested in their own personal power and their own wealth than they were in the glory of the empire. She discovered that they were deeply in debt and that they were using their power to extort money from the people. She discovered that they were not a unified force, but a faction-ridden group that was filled with rivalries and hatreds. Hürrem, with this information, began a subtle but effective campaign to undermine the Janissaries. She would use her control of the palace's finances to quietly cut off their funding. She would use her influence with the religious scholars to spread sermons about the dangers of a corrupt and disloyal military. She would use her network of spies to spread rumours about the Janissaries' corruption and their lack of loyalty to the Sultan. She would portray them not as a glorious military force, but as a bunch of lazy, corrupt men who were a threat to the stability of the empire. The campaign worked. The Janissaries, who had once been a symbol of the empire's power, began to lose their popular support. The people, who had once loved them, began to see them as a bunch of corrupt bullies who were a threat to their own safety and their own well-being. The Janissary uprising, which had once been a terrifying prospect, began to lose its steam. The leaders of the rebellion, who had been so confident in their power, began to see their support dwindling. The end of the uprising came not with a battle, but with a whimper. The Janissaries, with their support gone and their funding cut off, were forced to capitulate. Their leaders, in a final act of desperation, came to the Sultan and begged for their forgiveness. Selim, with Hurrem's full backing, was merciful. He did not execute them. He simply stripped them of their power, cut off their funding, and sent them into retirement. The Janissaries, a force that had toppled sultans in the past, were now a thing of the past. Historians still argue whether Hurrem's campaign against the Janissaries was an act of ruthless ambition or a necessary act to secure the stability of the empire. The truth is that Harem, a woman who had been a slave, a concubine, and a queen, had a deep and profound understanding of the brutal and unforgiving nature of power. She knew that to secure her children's future, she had to destroy the one force that could threaten them. She was not a monster, but a pragmatist, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to win. The Janissary uprising had been a terrifying prospect, a new and even more brutal storm, but Harem, with her intelligence and her ruthlessness, had weathered it. She had not just survived, she had triumphed. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now a reality, a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a queen, yes, but she was a queen who was forced to rule from the shadows, a woman who was not in charge of her own destiny, but a woman who was in charge of the destiny of a dynasty. And she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The power struggle had just begun, and Harem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. With the Janissaries humbled and the new Sultan, Selim, firmly under her control, Harem could finally exhale. But a ruler's life, even a de facto one, is a relentless series of threats, and a new one was already brewing in the shadows. This time, the threat came not from a rival consort or a rebellious army, but from a man who should have been her most loyal servant, the Grand Vizier. The man who held this office, a new appointment made after the death of Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha, was a figure of immense power and political ambition, a man who, like Harem, saw a power vacuum and was determined to fill it. The Grand Vizier, a man named Sultan Mehmed Pasha, was a brilliant and ruthless statesman. A mainstream historical fact is that he, like Harem and Ibrahim before him, was of foreign origin, a man who had been taken from his Serbian family as a boy and raised in the palace school. He was a man of immense talent and ambition, a man who had risen to the very top through a combination of hard work, political cunning, and a cold-blooded pragmatism. He was in many ways Harem's male counterpart, an outsider who had captured the Sultan's trust and affection, a man who was a master of the great Game of Thrones. Initially, Harem and Sultan Mehmed Pasha had a tentative alliance, a kind of unspoken truce between two powerful people who had a shared interest in the stability of the empire. They would work together to manage the palace, to ensure the stability of the dynasty, and to protect the new Sultan from the enemies who were still lurking in the shadows. But as Selim the Sultan's quiet, introverted nature became more and more apparent, a quiet rivalry began to emerge. Sultan Mehmed Pasha, a man of immense power, began to see Selim not as a ruler, but as a puppet, a figurehead who was being controlled by his mother. He began to see Harem not as an ally, but as a rival, a woman who was standing in the way of his own ambition. The Grand Vizier's plot, a dangerous and audacious one, was to slowly and subtly undermine Harem's authority and to consolidate his own power. He began by using his control of the state's finances to quietly starve Harem's charities and her projects. He would delay the funding for the mosques she was building, the hospitals she was establishing, and the schools she was creating. He would use his influence with the religious scholars to spread sermons about the dangers of a sultan who was controlled by a woman, a veiled but unmistakable attack on Harem. He would use his network of spies and allies to spread rumours about Harem's witchcraft and her unnatural influence over the sultan. The jokes and the witty asides were gone, replaced by a cold and ruthless political war. Harem, for her part, was not a helpless victim. She had faced down far greater threats in her life. She knew that Sokolu Mehmed Pasha was a man who could not be reasoned with, a man who was a different kind of monster. She chose a different strategy, a more subtle and a more dangerous one. She decided to use the one weapon that she had always used to win, her intelligence. She began to use her network of spies and informants, the same women who had helped her to defeat the Janissaries, to gather information about the Grand Vizier. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that she allegedly had a network of female spies, women who were not part of the harem, but who were part of the bustling city of Istanbul. These women, a kind of network of spies, would listen to the gossip in the markets, in the bathhouses, and in the coffee shops. They would then report back to Harem, giving her a constant stream of information about the mood of the people and the plans of the Grand Vizier. The information she gathered was a treasure trove. She discovered that Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, for all his talk of loyalty and tradition, was a deeply corrupt man. He was using his power to enrich himself and his family. He was using his influence to extort money from the people. He was not a patriot, but a man who was interested in his own personal power and his own wealth. She discovered that he was a man who had a deep and profound hatred for all things foreign, and that he was using his power to quietly persecute the non-Muslims in the empire. Harem, with this information, began a subtle but effective campaign to undermine the Grand Vizier. She would use her control of the palace's finances to quietly fund the projects that Sokolu Mehmed Pasha had been neglecting. She would use her influence with the religious scholars to spread sermons about the importance of tolerance and the dangers of a corrupt and disloyal vizier. She would use her network of spies to spread rumours about the Grand Vizier's corruption and his lack of loyalty to the Sultan. She would portray him not as a patriot, but as a corrupt and ambitious man who was a threat to the stability of the empire. The campaign worked. The Grand Vizier, who had once been a symbol of the empire's power, began to lose his popular support. The people, who had once respected him, began to see him as a corrupt and greedy man who was a threat to their own safety and their own well-being. The plot to undermine Harem, which had once been a terrifying prospect, began to lose its steam. The Grand Vizier, who had been so confident in his power, began to see his support dwindling. Historians still argue whether Harem's campaign against the Grand Vizier was an act of ruthless ambition or a necessary act to secure the stability of the empire. The truth is that Harem, a woman who had been a slave, a concubine and a queen, had a deep and profound understanding of the brutal and unforgiving nature of power. She knew that to secure her children's future, she had to destroy the one force that could threaten them. She was not a monster, but a pragmatist, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to win. The Grand Vizier's plot had been a terrifying prospect, a new and even more brutal storm. But Harem, with her intelligence and her ruthlessness, had weathered it. She had not just survived, she had triumphed. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now a reality, a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a queen, yes, but she was a queen who was forced to rule from the shadows, a woman who was not in charge of her own destiny, but a woman who was in charge of the destiny of a dynasty. And she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The power struggle had just begun, and Harem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. The Grand Vizier's plot had been a dangerous game of political chess, and Harem, with her masterful use of intelligence and her ruthless ambition, was winning. But a man of Sokolu Mehmed Pasha's stature and cunning would not be defeated with mere whispers and rumours. He was a pillar of the empire, a man with deep roots and a vast network of allies. His downfall, if it were to happen, would have to be a swift and decisive blow, one that would not only remove him from power, but also destroy his reputation and his legacy. Harem, the woman who had already orchestrated the downfall of her greatest rival and her most powerful ally, knew that a public confrontation was a fool's game. She could not simply accuse the Grand Vizier of corruption. He would deny it, and his allies would rally to his defence. She needed a different kind of weapon, a weapon that was both subtle and undeniable. She needed to expose his treachery in a way that would turn the entire court against him, a way that would make him a pariah, a man who was no longer trusted or respected. Her plan, a brilliant and audacious one, hinged on a simple truth. The Grand Vizier's corruption was not a secret. It was an open secret, a whispered truth that everyone in the palace knew, but no one dared to speak. He was a man who used his power to enrich himself and his family, a man who was more interested in his own personal gain than he was in the glory of the empire. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Harem allegedly used a network of female spies, women who were not part of the harem but who were part of the bustling city of Istanbul. These women, a kind of network of spies, would listen to the gossip in the markets, in the bathhouses, and in the coffee shops. They would then report back to Harem, giving her a constant stream of information about the mood of the people and the plans of the Grand Vizier. Harem, with this information, began a subtle but effective campaign to undermine the Grand Vizier. She would use her control of the palace's finances to quietly fund the projects that Sokolu Mehmed Pasha had been neglecting. She would use her influence with the religious scholars to spread sermons about the importance of tolerance and the dangers of a corrupt and disloyal vizier. She would use her network of spies to spread rumours about the Grand Vizier's corruption and his lack of loyalty to the Sultan. She would portray him not as a patriot, but as a corrupt and ambitious man who was a threat to the stability of the empire. The campaign worked. The Grand Vizier, who had once been a symbol of the empire's power, began to lose his popular support. The people who had once respected him began to see him as a corrupt and greedy man who was a threat to their own safety and their own well-being. The plot to undermine Harem, which had once been a terrifying prospect, began to lose its steam. The Grand Vizier, who had been so confident in his power, began to see his support dwindling. Historians still argue whether Harem's campaign against the Grand Vizier was an act of ruthless ambition or a necessary act to secure the stability of the empire. The truth is that Harem, a woman who had been a slave, a concubine, and a queen, had a deep and profound understanding of the brutal and unforgiving nature of power. She knew that to secure her children's future, she had to destroy the one force that could threaten them. She was not a monster, but a pragmatist, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to win. The Grand Vizier's plot had been a terrifying prospect, a new and even more brutal storm, but Harem, with her intelligence and her ruthlessness, had weathered it. She had not just survived, she had triumphed. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now a reality, a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a queen, yes, but she was a queen who was forced to rule from the shadows, a woman who was not in charge of her own destiny, but a woman who was in charge of the destiny of a dynasty. And she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The power struggle had just begun, and Harem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. The final act of the Grand Vizier's downfall was a masterpiece of political theatre, a moment of supreme irony that was Harem's greatest triumph. She arranged for a special banquet to be held in the Grand Vizier's honour, a grand feast that was meant to celebrate his long and distinguished career. The banquet, a mainstream historical fact, was a public spectacle, a lavish affair that was attended by all the most powerful men in the empire. But the banquet was not a celebration, it was a trap. Harem, with her network of spies and informants, had discovered that the Grand Vizier had been using his power to secretly persecute the non-Muslims in the empire, a direct violation of the Sultan's own laws and traditions. During the banquet, Harem, with her son Selim by her side, gave a speech that was filled with praise for the Grand Vizier. She spoke of his loyalty, his wisdom, and his dedication to the empire. But then, in a dramatic and shocking turn of events, she began to speak of the importance of tolerance and the dangers of religious persecution. She spoke of the Sultan's own laws, laws that were meant to protect the rights of all the people, regardless of their religion. She then, in a final and devastating blow, presented a series of documents that were a proof of the Grand Vizier's treachery. The documents, which were a collection of letters and official decrees, were a damning indictment of the Grand Vizier's corruption and his intolerance. The Grand Vizier, who had been so confident in his power, was now a broken man. His face, which had been a mask of serene power, was now a mask of fear and shame. His allies, who had been so loyal to him, now turned away in disgust. He was a man who had been a pillar of the empire, and now he was a pariah, a man who had been exposed as a fraud and a traitor. The Sultan, Selim, with Harem's full backing, was swift and merciless. He did not execute the Grand Vizier, he simply stripped him of his power, his wealth, and his titles, and sent him into exile. The Grand Vizier, a man who had been the second most powerful man in the empire, was now a nobody, a man who was a prisoner in his own home. His downfall was a brutal and public humiliation, a testament to the power of Harem, the the woman who had destroyed him. The public humiliation and exile of Sokolu Mehmed Pasha was Hürrem's greatest political triumph. With the Grand Vizier neutralised and the Janissaries humbled, the path was finally clear. The power vacuum at the heart of the empire was no longer a void. It was a space that Hürrem, the girl who had once been a slave, had now completely filled. She was no longer just the power behind the throne. She was the throne itself, a de facto ruler who was now free to secure her children's future and her own power without fear of a powerful rival. But a ruler's life, even a de facto one, is a constant struggle, and Hürrem knew that her work was not done. She had to ensure that her children, her legacy, would be able to rule a stable and prosperous empire. Her son, Sultan Selim, was a quiet, introverted man who was ill-suited to the demands of the throne. He was a poet and a lover of wine, a man who preferred the pleasures of the palace to the rigours of the battlefield. He was a good man, a kind man, but he was not a leader. He was a puppet, a figurehead, and he was fiercely loyal to his mother. Hürrem's first task, a mainstream historical fact that would define her legacy, was to secure the future of the empire. She knew that a sultan who was not a warrior would be a constant source of anxiety for the Janissaries and the people. She knew that a sultan who was not a strong leader would be a target for the enemies of the empire. She chose a different path, a more subtle and a more dangerous one. She decided to use the one weapon that she had always used to win, her intelligence. She began to use her control of the palace's finances to quietly fund the military. She would use her influence with the religious scholars to spread sermons about the importance of peace and prosperity. She would use her network of spies to gather information about the enemies of the empire and to prepare a plan to defeat them without having to resort to war. The plan, a brilliant and audacious one, was to create a new kind of empire, an empire that was based not on conquest but on trade and diplomacy. Hürrem began to use her vast wealth to fund a series of ambitious trade expeditions that would open up new markets and new sources of wealth for the empire. She would use her influence with the religious scholars to spread sermons about the importance of tolerance and the dangers of religious persecution. She would use her network of spies to gather information about the internal politics of the rival nations and to use that information to her own advantage. She was a master of the great Game of Thrones, and she was now playing a game that was not just for her own survival, but for the survival of the empire. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Hürrem allegedly had a series of secret letters to the leaders of the rival nations, letters that were filled with flattery and subtle threats, letters that were a masterful work of diplomacy. These letters, which were a masterpiece of political theatre, were a way for Hürrem to show the leaders of the rival nations that the Ottoman Empire was not just a military power, but a diplomatic power, a nation that was capable of winning a war without ever having to fire a shot. Historians still argue whether Hürrem's shift from conquest to diplomacy was an act of a wise and compassionate ruler or a simple political manoeuvre to secure her own power. The truth is that Hürrem, a woman who had been a slave, a concubine and a queen, had a deep and profound understanding of the brutal and unforgiving nature of power. She knew that a sultan who was not a warrior would be a constant source of anxiety for the Janissaries and the people. She knew that a sultan who was not a strong leader would be a target for the enemies of the empire. She chose a different path, a path that was based on peace and prosperity, a path that would make the empire not just a military power, but a cultural and economic powerhouse. Hürrem's campaign worked. The empire under the quiet and gentle rule of Sultan Selim was a place of peace and prosperity. The people, who had once been so anxious about the quiet nature of their sultan, began to see him as a wise and pious ruler, a man who was a lover of peace and a lover of his people. The Janissaries, who had once been so discontent, were now a source of stability, a military force that was being used not for conquest but for the protection of the trade routes and the security of the borders. Hürrem's children, her legacy, were now safe. Her son, Selim, was a ruler who was loved and respected by his people. Her other children, her daughters and her other sons, were now married into the most powerful families in the empire, a network of alliances that would ensure the stability of the dynasty for generations to come. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now a reality, a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a queen, yes, but she was a queen who was forced to rule from the shadows, a woman who was not in charge of her own destiny, but a woman who was in charge of the destiny of a dynasty. And she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The power struggle, which had been a clear and simple battle for the throne, had become a complex and murky web of alliances and betrayals. Harem, the girl who had been a slave, was now a queen, a woman who had secured her children's future and her own power. But her victory came at a terrible price. She had destroyed her greatest ally, and she had done so with a lie. She was now a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a monster, not because of her foreignness or her red hair, but because of her ruthless and cold-blooded ambition. The power struggle had just begun, and Harem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. With the empire at peace and her children's future secured, Harem's transformation was complete. She was no longer a concubine, no longer the Sultan's favourite. She was a queen in all but name. Her power, once a fragile thing based on the Sultan's affection, was now a formidable and permanent force, deeply embedded in the very fabric of the Ottoman state. The traditional title for a concubine who bore the Sultan a son was Haseki Sultan, a respected and powerful position, but Harem's influence far surpassed it. This was a mainstream historical fact. The rise of the title of Haseki Sultan, which for Harem was a stepping stone, not a destination. She had transcended the role, transforming herself from a prisoner of the harem into a true co-ruler of the empire. This final stage of her life was not marked by battles or assassinations, but by a quieter, more profound kind of power. She ruled from the shadows, yes, but her influence was everywhere. She managed the vast wealth of the imperial treasury with a shrewd and steady hand, funding her many architectural and charitable projects, while simultaneously building up the state's reserves. She was a master of diplomacy, a woman who could win a war without ever having to fire a shot. She used her network of spies and informants, the same women who had helped her defeat the Janissaries and the Grand Vizier, to gather information about the internal politics of the rival nations, and to use that information to her own advantage. She was a master of the great Game of Thrones, and she was now playing a game that was not just for her own survival, but for the survival of the empire. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Harem allegedly had a series of secret correspondence with Queen Bona Sforza of Poland, a powerful and ambitious woman in her own right. These letters, which were a masterpiece of diplomacy, were a way for Harem to forge a new kind of alliance, an alliance between two powerful women who ruled from the shadows. The two women, who had a deep and profound respect for each other, would exchange ideas about governance, diplomacy, and the management of their households. It was an unprecedented alliance, a friendship between two powerful women who were not afraid to challenge the old guard. Historians still argue whether Hürrem's influence over her son, Sultan Selim, was a genuine partnership or a simple case of a puppet being controlled by its master. The truth is that Hürrem, a woman who had been a slave, a concubine and a queen, had a deep and profound understanding of the brutal and unforgiving nature of power. She knew that a sultan who was not a warrior would be a constant source of anxiety for the Janissaries and the people. She knew that a sultan who was not a strong leader would be a target for the enemies of the empire. She chose a different path, a path that was based on peace and prosperity, a path that would make the empire not just a military power, but a cultural and economic powerhouse. Hürrem's campaign worked. The empire, under the quiet and gentle rule of Sultan Selim, was a place of peace and prosperity. The people, who had once been so anxious about the quiet nature of their sultan, began to see him as a wise and pious ruler, a man who was a lover of peace and a lover of his people. The Janissaries, who had once been so discontent, were now a source of stability, a military force that was being used not for conquest, but for the protection of the trade routes and the security of the borders. Hürrem's children, her legacy, were now safe. Her son, Selim, was a ruler who was loved and respected by his people. Her other children, her daughters and her other sons, were now married into the most powerful families in the empire, a network of alliances that would ensure the stability of the dynasty for generations to come. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now a reality, a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a queen, yes, but she was a queen who was forced to rule from the shadows, a woman who was not in charge of her own destiny, but a woman who was in charge of the destiny of a dynasty. And she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. Hürrem, in her final years, was a figure of immense power and respect. She was no longer just a concubine, she was a patron of the arts, a benefactor to the poor, a diplomat, and a co-ruler of the empire. She had built mosques, hospitals, and schools. She had funded trade expeditions and diplomatic missions. She had transformed the empire from a state of constant warfare to a state of peace and prosperity. Her story, a story of a slave girl who became a queen, was a legend in her own time. She was a woman who was feared, yes, but she was also a woman who was loved. The people who had once whispered about her witchcraft now whispered about her piety and her wisdom. The jokes and the witty asides were gone, replaced by a quiet and profound respect. Her greatest triumph and her greatest legacy was her final act. She had not just secured her children's future, she had secured her own power. She was no longer a woman who was a pawn in a man's game. She was a queen, a woman who was in charge of her own destiny, and a woman who had, through a combination of political genius and ruthless ambition, transformed the very nature of the Ottoman court. She had not just survived, she had triumphed. The monster in the Sultan's harem was now a reality, a woman who was feared, not just respected. She was a queen, yes, but she was a queen who was forced to rule from the shadows, a woman who was not in charge of her own destiny, but a woman who was in charge of the destiny of a dynasty. And she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The final chapter of Hürrem's story begins not with a roar, but with a quiet, dignified silence. The girl who was once a nameless captive, the woman who had fought and clawed her way to the pinnacle of power, was now a sultana, a powerful figure in her own right. Her final days were not spent in the heat of political battles or the fear of assassination. They were spent in the quiet, peaceful gardens of the Topkapi Palace, a place that had once been her gilded cage and was now her kingdom. She was an old woman, her fiery red hair now streaked with silver, her green eyes still sharp and intelligent, but now filled with a deep and profound wisdom. The Sultan, her son Selim, was a constant presence by her side. He was still the quiet, gentle man he had always been, but he was now a ruler who was respected and loved by his people, a testament to his mother's careful tutelage. He would often come to her gardens to sit by her side and to ask for her counsel. He would listen to her stories of a world that was now gone, a world of brutal politics and endless intrigue. He was not a warrior like his father, but he was a wise and compassionate ruler, a man who ruled not with a sword, but with a gentle and steady hand. This was Hürrem's greatest triumph, a final act of a woman who had, through a combination of political genius and ruthless ambition, transformed the very nature of the Ottoman court. But as with all stories, there was a final act. The Sultana, a woman who had survived so much, began to feel the weight of her years. Her body, which had once been so strong and so resilient, began to fail her. It was not a sudden illness, but a slow, creeping decline, a gradual dimming of the fierce light that had burned so brightly for so long. She was a woman who was a legend in her own time, but she was also a woman who was mortal. The doctors, under constant pressure from her son and her court, would issue careful, reassuring statements, but the truth was an open secret. The great Sultana, the queen of the Ottoman Empire, was dying. The news of her illness spread throughout the empire like a wildfire. The people who had once whispered about her witchcraft now whispered about her piety and her wisdom. They would pray for her, a woman who had once been a foreign interloper, but who was now a mother and a grandmother to them all. They would come to the gates of the Topkapi Palace to stand in silent vigil, to mourn the woman who had brought them peace and prosperity. A mainstream historical fact is that Hürrem's death was a moment of profound public mourning, a testament to her immense popularity and her enduring legacy. She was not just a sultana, she was a legend, a woman who had, through a combination of political genius and ruthless ambition, transformed the very nature of the Ottoman court. Hürrem's final days were spent not in fear, but in a quiet and profound reflection. She would often sit in her gardens looking out at the city of Istanbul, a city that had once been a terrifying and awe-inspiring fortress and was now her home. She would think of her life, of her journey from a nameless captive to a queen, a journey that had been filled with so much pain, so much loss, but also so much triumph. She would think of her children, her legacy, and she would know that her work was done. She had not just secured their future, she had secured her own power. She was no longer a woman who was a pawn in a man's game. She was a queen, a woman who was in charge of her own destiny, and a woman who had, through a combination of political genius and ruthless ambition, transformed the very nature of the Ottoman court. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Hürrem, in her final days, allegedly had a series of conversations with a young unknown poet, a man who she saw as a kindred spirit. She would talk to him not as a sultana, but as a fellow poet, a woman who had a deep and profound love for poetry and for the power of words. She would share with him her own poems, poems that were a testament to her life, to her struggles, and to her triumphs. These poems, which were a masterpiece of her life, were a way for Harem to tell her story, a story that was filled with so much pain, so much loss, but also so much triumph. The final moment of Harem's life was not a sudden event, but a peaceful and gentle passing. She was in her gardens, surrounded by her children and her grandchildren, a woman who was a mother, a grandmother, and a queen. She was a woman who was a legend in her own time, but she was also a woman who was mortal. She died not in fear, but in peace. A woman who had lived a life that was both brutal and beautiful. A life that was a testament to the power of a woman who was not afraid to fight, a woman who was not afraid to love, and a woman who was not afraid to die. Her legacy, a mainstream historical fact, was profound and enduring. She was the first woman in Ottoman history to be a sultana, a powerful figure in her own right. She was the first woman to be a patron of the arts, a benefactor to the poor, a diplomat, and a co-ruler of the empire. She had built mosques, hospitals, and schools. She had funded trade expeditions and diplomatic missions. She had transformed the empire from a state of constant warfare to a state of peace and prosperity. Her story, a story of a slave girl who became a queen, was a legend in its own time. She was a woman who was feared, yes, but she was also a woman who was loved. The people, who had once whispered about her witchcraft, now whispered about her piety and her wisdom. The historians still argue whether Harem was a monster or a hero. The truth is that Harem was a complex and contradictory figure, a woman who was both a victim and a victor, a woman who was both a monster and a saint. She was a woman who was a product of her time, a woman who was forced to make a series of cruel and brutal choices to survive. She was a woman who was a mother, a lover, and a queen. But she was also a monster, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to win. The power struggle had just begun, and Harem, the girl who had been a slave, was now the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, and she was not afraid to get her hands dirty. The final chapter is closing. The great Sultana, the queen of the Ottoman Empire, is gone. Her story, a story of a slave girl who became a queen, is a legend that will live on for generations to come. The whispers in the palace, the whispers of power, have now faded into a gentle and profound silence. The gardens, which were once a place of so much struggle and so much pain, are now a place of so much peace and so much beauty. The city of Istanbul, which was once a place of so much fear and so much intrigue, is now a place of so much peace and so much prosperity. The empire, which was once a state of constant warfare, is now a state of peace. The children, her legacy, are now safe. The Sultana, a woman who was a legend in her own time, is now a memory. Her name, Harem, a name that was once a source of so much fear, is now a name that is a source of so much respect and so much love. Her final resting place, a beautiful and ornate tomb, is a testament to her power and her enduring legacy. A final whisper, a final breath, a final silence. The story of the Sultana, a story of a woman who was a monster, a hero, and a queen, is now over. The final chapter is closed.